The first snow always comes early in these mountains. You learn to read the signs, the way the air thins out, how the ravens move lower through the valleys, the particular smell of cold that works its way through every crack in the walls. When you live this far from town, when your nearest neighbor is a 20-minute walk through timber, you learn that winter isn't just a season, it's a negotiation. And if you're not prepared, if you haven't thought through every detail, winter wins. Before we go any further, if you value stories about practical ingenuity, about solving real problems with your hands and your head, hit that subscribe button. This channel is about learning from the people who figure things out the hard way, and there's a lot more where this came from. The cabin sat on a small rise where the forest began to thin, just visible from the logging road that served as the only real connection to the outside world during the warmer months. It wasn't much to look at. Rough-cut timber, a metal roof that sang in the wind, 2 rooms and a sleeping loft that stayed cold enough to see your breath most mornings. The man who lived there had bought the property for almost nothing 3 years back, mostly because nobody else wanted to deal with the isolation or the work it would take to make the place livable. He was in his early 50s, lean in the way that comes from physical work rather than exercise, with hands that showed old scars from carpentry and the kind of steady, methodical movements that suggested he'd spent most of his life solving problems without much help. The cabin had 1 wood stove, a heavy cast-iron unit in the main room that could throw serious heat when you fed it right. But here was the problem. That heat stayed where it was. The bedroom stayed cold. The loft stayed colder. You could bank the fire overnight and wake up to ice on the inside of the windows anywhere that wasn't within 10 feet of the stove. He'd tried fans, tried leaving doors open, tried a dozen small adjustments that never quite worked. The wood consumption was brutal because you had to keep the fire roaring just to get any warmth past the main room, and even then you were burning through your winter supply at a rate that didn't make sense. So he started thinking about the problem differently. Not about moving heat after it was made, but about making the heat move where you needed it in the first place. The idea came to him slowly, the way most good ideas do, not as a flash of inspiration, but as a gradual realization that there might be another way. What if the chimney itself could be the radiator? What if instead of one straight shot up through the roof, the flue ran through multiple rooms before exiting? The same fire, the same wood, but the heat path distributed through the whole structure instead of wasted straight into the sky. He sketched it out on scrap paper first, then on the back of a feed catalog, then finally on proper graph paper he drove 40 minutes to town to buy. 4 separate channels, each running through a different part of the cabin, all meeting at a central stack that would exit through the roof at one point. It would require serious masonry work, careful attention to draft and airflow, and probably 100 small problems he hadn't thought of yet. But the logic was sound. Heat doesn't just go up, it radiates out. If you ran thermal mass through your living space, that mass would give off heat long after the fire itself had died down. It was basic physics, the kind of thing homesteaders had understood 100 years ago before central heating made everyone forget how fire actually worked. The neighbors thought he was out of his mind. There were 3 other cabins within walking distance, seasonal places mostly, though one older couple lived year-round about a mile down the valley. When word got around about what he was planning, and word always gets around, even out here, the reactions ranged from skeptical to openly mocking. 4-way chimney. 4 separate flues. They said it wouldn't draft right, that the smoke would back up, that he'd burn the place down or suffocate himself with carbon monoxide. They said it was overcomplicated, that he was trying to reinvent something that didn't need reinventing. One man, a logger who'd lived in these mountains his whole life, stopped by specifically to tell him it wouldn't work, that you couldn't split a draft like that without losing all your pull, that the smoke would find the path of least resistance and you'd end up with 3 cold chimneys and one that couldn't keep up. He listened to all of it, nodded politely, and kept working. Because the thing about living this far out is that you learn to trust your own thinking. You learn that most people's opinions about what will or won't work are based on what they've seen done before, not on what's actually possible. and you learn that the only way to really know if something will work is to build it and see. The work started in late August when the weather was still good and he had time before the season turned. He'd salvaged materials all summer: fire brick from a demolished school building in town, sections of steel flue pipe from an old sawmill that was being torn down, fire clay and refractory cement bought in bulk from a supplier 3 counties over. The existing stove would stay where it was, but he'd need to rebuild the entire chimney system from the ground up. That meant tearing out the old flue, reinforcing the floor joists where the new masonry would run, and carefully planning every angle, every turn, every clean-out access point. The first channel would run straight up from the stove through the main room, just like before, but now it would be surrounded by additional thermal mass, a double-wall design with an air gap that would radiate heat even after the fire cooled. The second channel would branch off at ceiling height, run horizontally through a carefully insulated chase behind the bedroom wall, then angle up through the bedroom itself before rejoining the main stack. The third would do the same on the opposite side, serving the small kitchen area and food storage room that stayed ice-cold in winter. The fourth, and this was the tricky one, would run through the floor joists, up through the sleeping loft, maximizing contact with living space before finally meeting the others at a central collection point above the roofline. Every joint had to be airtight. Every angle had to maintain draft. He worked with a level and a plumb bob, with mortar and fire-rated silicone, checking and rechecking measurements because there was no room for error. The brick channels were heavy, and he was working alone, so everything took longer than it would have with help. But working alone meant nobody questioning every decision, nobody saying it couldn't be done, nobody adding doubt to a project that already had enough variables. The physics of draft became his obsession. Hot air rises, everyone knows that, but making it rise predictably through multiple pathways requires understanding pressure differentials, understanding how temperature affects air density, understanding that every bend in the flue creates resistance that has to be compensated for by height or by the intensity of the fire itself. He installed adjustable dampers at each branch point, simple slide plates that would let him balance the draw between channels depending on wind conditions and fire intensity. He built in clean-out doors at every horizontal run, knowing that creosote would accumulate and need to be cleared. He wrapped the horizontal chases in mineral wool insulation to prevent heat loss before the flue gases had given up their thermal energy to the surrounding masonry. There were setbacks. The first time he tried to set the bedroom channel, the mortar wouldn't set properly because the temperature had dropped overnight and he'd underestimated how much the cold would affect the cure time. He had to tear it out and start over. One section of salvaged flue pipe turned out to have a hairline crack that he didn't notice until he pressure tested the system with smoke, and he spent 2 days tracking down a replacement. The angles through the floor joists were tighter than he'd planned, and he had to notch the beams more than he was comfortable with, then reinforce them with steel plates to maintain structural integrity. By the time October arrived, the system was built but untested. He'd done everything he could on paper and in planning, but until you actually lit a fire and watched how the smoke moved, how the heat transferred, how the draft pulled under real-world conditions, you didn't really know if you'd made something functional or just an elaborate failure. The neighbors were still skeptical. The old couple from down the valley stopped by and looked at the 4 separate flue openings coming together at the roofline and said it looked complicated, which out here is usually another way of saying someone's wasted their time. The first test fire was small, cautious, just kindling and a few splits of dry pine to see if the draft would pull at all. He opened all the dampers fully, let air into the system, and struck a match. The kindling caught. Smoke began to rise, and for a long 30 seconds it seemed like nothing was happening the way it should. Smoke leaked back into the room. Not much, but enough to make his eyes water. His heart sank. But then he felt it. The subtle shift in air pressure as the flue warmed, as the column of hot air established itself. The backdraft stopped. The smoke pulled clean and hard straight up through all 4 channels simultaneously. He could hear it. A low rushing sound like wind in a pipe, and when he went outside to check the roof exit, A solid plume of smoke was rising straight up into the October sky. Over the next weeks, he refined the system. He learned that the bedroom channel needed slightly less damper opening than the others because it had more horizontal run and created more resistance. He learned that when the wind came from the east, you had to close the loft damper part way, or it would pull too hard and rob draft from the main room. He learned that the fire brick surrounding the stove held heat for hours after the fire died down, radiating warmth well into the night. And, most importantly, he learned that the system worked exactly as he'd hoped. The same fire that would have heated one room was now heating 4, and doing it more efficiently because the heat wasn't escaping unused into the atmosphere. November came in hard that year. The first serious cold front dropped temperatures into the single digits and brought snow that didn't melt. This is when you find out if your preparations were enough, when theory meets reality and there's no room left for optimism or wishful thinking. He split wood in the pre-dawn darkness, stacked it under the porch where it would stay dry, checked the chimney for ice dams and creosote accumulation. The cabin, for the first time since he'd owned it, stayed warm in every room. Not blazing hot, not like some modern house with forced air heat, but genuinely, continuously warm. You could sleep in the loft without 3 blankets. You could work at the kitchen table without gloves. The bedroom was actually comfortable enough to undress without hurrying. The neighbors noticed. They had to. Smoke was coming from his cabin, but not the constant heavy smoke of a fire being driven hard to compensate for heat loss. This was the thin, clean smoke of a fire burning efficiently, a fire that was doing its job without being overworked. And when the old couple stopped by in mid-November to drop off venison from their fall harvest, hospitality is its own kind of currency this far from town, they felt the difference immediately. The bedroom was warm. They mentioned it, not making a big deal out of it, but you could hear the surprise in their voices. The real test came in early December. A low-pressure system stalled over the mountains and brought with it the kind of cold that makes the trees crack, the kind of cold where stepping outside without proper gear can be genuinely dangerous. Temperatures dropped below 0 and stayed there for 4 days straight. The wind came in gusts that shook the cabin walls and sent snow devils spinning through the clearings. This was the scenario he'd been preparing for all along: extreme cold, limited daylight to work in, and the absolute need to keep the fire going without burning through his entire wood supply in a single week. He loaded the stove at dusk on the first night of the cold snap, filled it with hardwood, oak and maple that he'd been saving for exactly this kind of weather. He adjusted the dampers, checked that each channel was pulling correctly, and banked the coals in a way that would give slow, sustained heat overnight, rather than a quick, hot burn. The wind was coming from the northwest, which meant he had to partially close the loft damper and open the bedroom channel a bit more to compensate. These adjustments had become second nature by now, the same way a sailor reads the wind without thinking about it. Around 2 in the morning, he woke to the sound of the wind driving snow against the windows in waves, a sound like sand being thrown in handfuls. The cabin was still warm, but he got up anyway, the habit of monitoring the fire too ingrained to ignore. The main room held steady heat. He put his hand against the bedroom wall where the flue ran behind the plaster. Warm to the touch, not hot enough to be dangerous, but warm enough to radiate through the structure. The loft was the same. Even the kitchen, the furthest point from the stove itself, maintained a temperature that meant liquid water instead of ice. But there was a sound that wasn't right, a low whistling that came and went with the wind gusts, and a subtle backdraft smell. Not smoke exactly, but the faint bitter scent of creosote. He traced it to the bedroom damper. The wind was creating strange pressure differentials around the cabin, and the horizontal run through the bedroom chase was experiencing momentary reversals in draft. Not enough to push smoke into the room, but enough to disrupt the clean pull he needed for efficient combustion. He made the adjustment in the dark, using a flashlight to see the damper controls he'd installed at floor level. Closed the bedroom channel by half, opened the main room damper to compensate. The whistling stopped. The backdraft smell faded. The system rebalanced itself, and the heat distribution evened out again. Small problems, constant adjustments, the ongoing negotiation between what you've built and what the weather demands of it. This is what it means to heat with wood in a climate like this. You're not just burning fuel, you're managing a living system that responds to a dozen variables you only partly control. By dawn, the wind had shifted again, now coming from the south, and he had to readjust the dampers once more. The fire itself had burned down to a deep bed of coals, still throwing serious heat but ready for fresh wood. He opened the stove door carefully, used an ash rake to pull the coals forward, and loaded 3 large splits of maple across the coal bed at angles that would let air flow between them. The wood caught within seconds, flames licking up around the bark, and the draft pulled hard and clean through all 4 channels. Outside, the thermometer read 6 below zero. Inside, the cabin stayed warm enough that he could make coffee in the kitchen without needing to stand next to the stove. The cold snap lasted 4 days. 4 days of sub-zero temperatures, of managing the fire around the clock, of clearing snow from the porch so he could access the woodpile, of checking the roof-mounted spark arrestor to make sure it wasn't icing up and restricting draft. He burned through less wood than he'd expected, significantly less than he would have burned in winters past when the cabin had only the single flue system. The math was simple but compelling. The same amount of fuel producing usable heat in 4 times the space. Not magic, not some revolutionary discovery, just basic thermodynamics applied with attention and care. On the 5th day, the weather broke. The temperature climbed back up into the 20s, which felt almost warm by comparison. The sun came out, and the snow began to soften slightly during the peak daylight hours. He went outside to inspect the chimney stack, looking for any ice damage or signs of stress from the extreme cold. Everything looked solid. The mortar joints had held. The metal flashing around the roof penetration showed no gaps. The system had weathered its first major test without failing. That afternoon, the logger from up the ridge came by. He didn't announce himself, just walked up through the snow and knocked on the door the way neighbors do out here when they want to talk but don't want to make it into a formal visit. He'd noticed the smoke patterns during the cold snap, noticed how little wood seemed to be going through the system relative to the conditions. He asked if he could see how it worked. The question surprised him, not because the logger was asking, but because the tone was different now. Not skeptical, not mocking, but genuinely curious. He showed him the system, explained the basic logic of distributed thermal mass, pointed out the damper controls and the clean-out access points. The logger listened, asked practical questions about creosote buildup and draft maintenance, about how much wood the system saved over a winter season. The conversation was technical, focused on real-world function rather than theory. At the end of it, the logger nodded and said something about how maybe complicated wasn't the same as wrong, which was probably the closest thing to an apology or admission of error you were going to get from someone who'd lived his whole life doing things a certain way. Word continued to spread in the small way it does in rural communities. The old couple mentioned the warm bedroom to someone else, who mentioned it to someone else, and by midwinter he'd had 3 separate visits from people wanting to see the 4-way system in person. Each time, he walked them through it, not lecturing, not making a big show of how clever he'd been, but explaining in straightforward terms what he'd built and why. He showed them the adjustable dampers, explained how you balance draft between channels, demonstrated how to check for creosote accumulation in the horizontal runs. He talked about safety, about the importance of proper clearances from combustible materials, about carbon monoxide detectors and regular chimney inspections, about the fact that you never stop monitoring and maintaining a system like this because fire demands respect and constant attention. Some of them seemed interested in building something similar. Others just wanted to understand how it was possible. A few remained skeptical even after seeing it work, which was fine. Not every solution fits every situation, and what made sense for his cabin might not make sense for someone else's setup. But the mockery was gone, replaced by something closer to grudging respect or at least acknowledgement that he'd solved a real problem in a way that worked. January brought more cold, more snow. the long stretch of deep winter when the days are short and the nights seem endless. He fell into a rhythm with the system, learned its sounds and behaviors the way you learn the temperament of a tool you use every day. The pinging of the stove as the metal expanded from heat, the rush of draft through the flues when the fire was burning hot, the particular smell of oak coals in the middle of the night, the way the bedroom wall felt warm to the touch even when the fire had been banked for hours. These became the textures of his daily life, unremarkable in their constancy but fundamental to survival in this place, in this season. He kept detailed notes about wood consumption, about which species burned cleanest in the system, about how weather patterns affected draft and how to compensate. Maple and oak were the workhorses, dense, slow-burning, clean combusting. Birch was good for quick heat but didn't last. Pine and fir were fine for kindling but created more creosote in the horizontal runs and needed more frequent cleaning. Ash was perfect when he could get it, splitting easy and burning hot with minimal residue. Each wood had its character, its place in the system, and learning to match fuel to need became another layer of competence in a life built around competence. The system required maintenance. Every 2 weeks he cleaned out the horizontal runs using a stiff brush and a shop vacuum, pulling accumulated creosote and ash from the clean-out doors he'd built into each channel. This wasn't optional. Creosote buildup reduces draft efficiency and creates fire risk, and in a system with multiple channels you couldn't afford to let any one section become clogged. The work was dirty, necessary, and oddly satisfying in the way that all maintenance is satisfying when you're taking care of something you built with your own hands. February came, and with it the subtle but noticeable lengthening of days, the first hints that winter, while still firmly in control, wouldn't last forever. The system continued to perform exactly as designed. Some mornings he'd wake to find frost patterns on the outside of the windows, intricate crystalline structures that caught the early light, and he'd realize that the inside of the windows were clear. No ice, no condensation, just glass. That small detail, more than any dramatic demonstration, showed that the heating system was working, that humidity and temperature were being managed in a way that kept the living space genuinely habitable rather than just barely survivable. The wood consumption numbers told their own story. By late February, he'd burned through roughly 60% of his winter wood supply. In previous years, at this same point, he'd have been looking at 80 or 90% consumption and worrying about making it through to spring without buying expensive emergency wood from town. The four-way system wasn't just keeping the cabin warmer, it was doing so more efficiently, stretching his resources further, reducing the margin of error that made winter living so precarious. One evening in early March, when the worst of the cold was definitively behind him, he sat in the main room and tried to calculate what the system had saved him. Not just in wood costs, though that was significant. Probably 2 cords of hardwood over the course of the winter, which translated to hundreds of dollars and dozens of hours of splitting and stacking labor. But also in comfort, in not waking up to frozen water buckets, in being able to live in the whole cabin rather than huddling in one heated room, in the simple reduction of daily stress that came from knowing the system could handle whatever weather came through. The neighbors, by this point, had mostly stopped commenting on it. The system worked, the proof was self-evident, and there wasn't much left to say. But the dynamic had shifted. When the logger stopped by in late March to talk about logging roads opening up for spring, he mentioned that he'd been thinking about his own cabin's heat distribution, about whether there were ways to improve it without going as complex as 4 channels but using some of the same principles. The old couple asked questions about damper adjustment when they visited. Word had spread beyond the immediate area. Someone from town had heard about it and drove out specifically to see the system, said he was building a cabin on property he'd bought on the other side of the valley and wanted to understand the approach. He answered questions when they came, shared what he'd learned, but he didn't make a crusade out of it. The system had solved his problem, and if it helped someone else solve theirs, that was good. But he wasn't looking for validation or recognition. Living out here teaches you that the best reward for solving a problem is having the problem solved. not collecting praise or proving people wrong. The cabin stayed warm. The wood lasted. That was enough. Spring came slowly, as it always does in the mountains. The snow receded in fits and starts, melting during the day and refreezing at night. The days grew longer, the angle of sunlight changed, and the morning temperatures gradually climbed above freezing and stayed there. He continued to run the fire most nights. Spring cold is real cold, and the cabin's thermal mass meant it took time to warm up after a cold night, but the urgency was gone. The season of negotiation with winter was over for another year. As he cleaned the system for the final time before letting the fire go cold for the season, pulling ash and creosote from every channel, inspecting every joint and seal for damage or wear, he thought about what the winter had taught him. Building the four-way system had been a risk, a commitment of time and resources and reputation in a place where all three mattered. People had doubted it would work. He'd had moments of doubt himself, usually at 3 a.m. when something wasn't drafting right and he was making adjustments by flashlight in the cold. But the doubt had been worth pushing through because the alternative was accepting inadequacy, accepting that winter meant suffering through cold in most of your living space, accepting inefficiency as inevitable. Too many people, he thought, stop at the conventional solution because it's conventional, because it's what everyone else does, because trying something different opens you up to criticism. Out here, that kind of thinking gets you nowhere. The winter doesn't care about conventions. The cold doesn't care about what's always been done. What matters is what works, what's been tested under real conditions, what you can depend on when the temperature drops and the wind picks up, and there's nobody coming to help if you've miscalculated. The four-way chimney wasn't revolutionary. It wasn't even particularly original. People had been using thermal mass for heat distribution for centuries, in different forms and configurations. What it was appropriate to his specific situation, his specific needs, his specific resources. It was a solution built from understanding rather than assumption, from careful attention to how heat moves and how structures work and how to balance competing demands for draft and warmth and efficiency. And it was proof, if you needed proof, that being told something won't work and having it actually not work are two entirely different things. As the season turned fully towards spring and the need for fire became occasional rather than constant, he thought ahead to next winter. There were improvements he wanted to make, better insulation around one of the horizontal chases, a more accessible clean-out door in the loft channel, maybe experimenting with a slightly different damper design that would be easier to adjust from inside the cabin. The system worked, but working systems can always be refined, always be made a little better, a little more efficient, a little more responsive to the specific demands they have to meet. Summer would bring other projects, other problems to solve. The roof needed attention in a few places. The water system needed an upgrade. There was always something demanding time and effort and thought. But the heating system, the four-way chimney that everyone said wouldn't work, was solved. It was proven. It was one less thing to worry about when the cold months came around again. And that, in the end, was the point. Not to be clever, not to prove skeptics wrong, not to be different for the sake of being different. Just to solve a real problem in a way that worked reliably and efficiently, in a way that made life in a harsh climate a little less harsh, in a way that let you focus your energy on the 100 other challenges that come with living this far from convenience and comfort. The cabin stayed warm, every corner of it, not just the space closest to the fire, and that warmth came from the same wood that would have been consumed anyway, just used better, just distributed more thoughtfully. If there's something to take away from this, it's that the conventional approach isn't always the best approach, and that skepticism from others is often just a reflection of their own limited experience rather than actual limits on what's possible. But it's also that building something unconventional means accepting responsibility for that choice, testing it thoroughly, monitoring it constantly, being honest about what works and what doesn't, and never assuming that because something worked once it will work forever without attention. The four-way system required more initial thought, more careful construction, and ongoing management that a simple single-flue setup wouldn't have demanded. But it delivered results that a simple setup couldn't match, and in the end, that trade was worth making. The mountains don't care about your heating system, don't care how clever or how conventional it is. They care whether you're prepared, whether you've thought things through, whether you've built something that will hold up when it needs to. The 4-way chimney held up. It did what it was designed to do. And next winter, when the first snow comes early and the cold settles in for the long months ahead, it will be ready to do it again. If you found this story valuable, if you appreciate hearing about real solutions to real problems, about the kind of practical ingenuity that comes from living close to the limits of what's comfortable or convenient, then subscribe to this channel. There are more stories like this, more examples of people who looked at a problem everyone said was unsolvable and solved it anyway, not through magic or genius, but through careful attention and the willingness to trust their own thinking. Hit that subscribe button, and you'll be part of a community that values this kind of knowledge, this kind of approach to the challenges that come with living deliberately in difficult places. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.